For a city dweller, the idea of escaping into the deep wilderness always feels like the perfect antidote to endless stress, noise, and the suffocating smog of the metropolis. We naively believe that by trekking dozens of miles into the heart of a national park, we leave all our anxieties and dangers behind, dissolving into the pristine serenity of an ancient forest. But the reality hidden beneath the thick canopy of trees can be incredibly harsh. In the middle of nowhere, where mobile phones turn into useless pieces of plastic and the nearest sheriff is several hours away, along broken gravel roads, the rules of the game change drastically. The thin nylon fabric of a camping tent becomes your only defense, a fragile illusion of security separating you from the absolute, unpredictable darkness of the night forest. And the most terrifying realization of all is that amidst these endless miles of wild nature, someone might be searching not for solitude, but for you. A young couple from Atlanta, thoroughly exhausted by a brutal work schedule, decided to spend a long May weekend in one of the most remote and inaccessible sectors of a national park in the Appalachian foothills. Being experienced hikers, they deliberately ignored the overcrowded commercial campgrounds with their noisy trailers and designated fire pits. Instead, they left their SUV in a small dead-end parking lot near a forest clearing and hiked nearly 4 miles into the dense wilderness, guiding their way with an old topographic map. By the time the sun began to lazy sink behind the rocky peaks, painting the sky in ominous crimson tones, they emerged onto a small, perfectly flat clearing enclosed by a tight ring of ancient 100-year-old pine trees. The air here was incredibly sharp and cold, and the surrounding silence felt so heavy that every single rustle of falling dry pine needles echoed clearly. They quickly pitched their 2-person tent, prepared a simple dinner on a gas burner, and exhausted from the long trek, crawled into their warm sleeping bags, looking forward to a peaceful night under the shelter of the forest. At around 3:15 a.m., the young man suddenly woke up. Inside the tent, a total, palpable darkness reigned, and the air temperature had dropped significantly, turning his breath into a faint mist. At first, he didn't understand what exactly had caused his consciousness to instantly snap out of a deep sleep, but his body had already reacted to danger. A wave of icy sweat broke out across his spine, and his heart began to hammer frantically against his ribs. He froze, holding his breath, and stared intensely into the darkness, trying to catch any sound from the outside. The forest, which had seemed so peaceful in the evening, now felt hostile and sinister. A few seconds later, a faint, soft snap of a dry twig reached his ears right near the head of the tent. This was not the chaotic step of a heavy wild animal like a bear or a deer. The sound was incredibly cautious, calculated, and distinctly bipedal. Someone was slowly, step by step, circling their small shelter, rustling the dry leaves on the ground. The young man carefully, trying not to make a single sound, reached his hand toward the pocket of his backpack, where a heavy hunting knife was kept. At that exact moment, the footsteps outside suddenly stopped. A deafening, crushing silence followed, in which it felt as though one could hear the blood rushing through his veins. He froze with his hand extended, terrified to even draw a breath. And then, right above his head, the fabric of the tent slightly flexed under someone's weight. The unknown night visitor didn't try to feel for the zipper, didn't attempt to cut the nylon with a knife, and didn't make any aggressive sounds. He simply stepped up completely against the tent, pressed his face hard against the stretched fabric just a few inches from the young man's head, and began to breathe heavily and raggedly. It was the moist, erratic breathing of a person who had been running for a long time, or was in a state of extreme agitation. The psychological agony of that moment was completely paralyzing, as the slow, wet warmth of the stranger's breath literally started to condense on the opposite side of the cold nylon, right where the young man's ear was pressed. Every ragged inhale sounded like a low, twisted rasp of a dying animal, a deliberate display of pure dominance meant to shatter their sanity without firing a single shot or saying a word. The pitch-black wilderness outside suddenly transformed into an inescapable tomb, where the tiny space inside the tent felt suffocatingly small, and the thick, heavy scent of damp earth and old decay seemed to seep directly through the seams. The stranger would occasionally pause his breathing for a few agonizing seconds, creating a vacuum of complete silence, only to press even harder against the frame, forcing the fiberglass poles to creak under a slow, menacing pressure that threatened to collapse their only barrier. Beside him, his girlfriend stirred, disturbed by a slight draft. He immediately intercepted her hand, clamping his palm firmly over her mouth before she could utter a single sound. In the dim moonlight filtering through the upper ventilation window, he saw her eyes widen in pure terror. She heard it too. This nightmare went on for an agonizingly long time. The person behind the tent wall did not leave. He stood there, swaying slightly, and his heavy, raspy exhales vibrated against the nylon canvas for 3 grueling hours until the first pale rays of dawn finally began to slowly dissolve the night darkness. As the forest began to take on the gray tones of dawn, the raspy breathing outside suddenly ceased. There was a faint, barely audible rustle of footsteps retreating toward a thick patch of wild bushes, and everything went dead quiet again. The couple sat motionless for another hour, afraid to believe the night nightmare was actually over. When the sun had fully risen, the young man, clutching the knife in his hand, cautiously unzipped the flap and stepped outside. The clearing was completely empty, but what they saw made their blood run cold. All of their camping gear that they had left outside the previous evening, folding chairs, pots, boots, and even empty tin cans, had been neatly, with a terrifying precision, arranged on the grass in a perfect, flawless circle, with their tent sitting right in the exact center. Panic-stricken, grabbing what they could, and abandoning their expensive tent in the clearing, they ran back to the car without looking back, covering the 4 miles in record time. But the biggest shock awaited them at the forest parking lot. On the windshield of their SUV, tucked neatly under the wiper, lay a small silver chain with a pendant, a piece of jewelry his girlfriend had accidentally lost at a gas station in their hometown a week before this trip. Someone had tracked them all the way from home. There is a unique kind of loneliness that exists within the deeply forgotten, abandoned spaces of the American wilderness. When a place that was once filled with the laughter of children and the bustling energy of summer life is suddenly left to rot for decades, it doesn't just become empty. It takes on a heavy, melancholic atmosphere that feels entirely unnatural. The decaying wooden cabins, the rusted playground swings swaying slowly in the wind, and the cracked concrete pathways overgrown with thick weeds all seem to whisper stories of the past. But entering these forgotten historical relics late at night is an entirely different level of foolishness. When the darkness falls over an abandoned camp hidden deep within a valley, you quickly realize that the isolation you sought isn't a sanctuary at all. It is a trap, and the silence of the woods can easily be shattered by a sound that indicates you are trapped in the territory of something deeply organized and highly dangerous. A group of 4 close friends from Seattle, who ran a popular urban exploration blog, decided to hike deep into the dense, foggy forests of Washington state to locate the ruins of a legendary summer camp that had been abandoned back in the late 1960s. They spent over 5 hours trekking off-trail through difficult terrain, carving their way through thick brush and climbing steep, muddy ridges until they finally descended into a hidden, isolated valley just as dusk was settling in. Scattered across the misty clearing were dozens of collapsing wooden cabins, their roofs caved in and windows shattered. The place felt like a ghost town frozen in time. Thrilled by the eerie atmosphere, the group decided it would be an incredible experience to spend the night right in the center of the abandoned camp. They pitched their large 4-person tent on a patch of dead grass between the old dining hall and a crumbling concrete bathhouse, lit a small campfire, and spent a couple of hours filming the desolate structures before retreating inside their sleeping bags to rest. At around 2:40 a.m., the atmosphere in the valley completely shifted. One of the friends, who was a light sleeper, woke up to a sudden absolute drop in the ambient noise of the forest. The constant chirping of the night crickets and the distant hooting of owls had completely vanished, leaving behind a heavy, suffocating silence. He sat up in his sleeping bag, straining his ears against the dark. A moment later, a sound echoed from the thick woods to the north that made his stomach instantly drop into a cold abyss. It was a sharp, clear, and melodic human whistle. It wasn't a random, casual noise. It was a distinct, 4-note musical pattern that cut through the freezing night air with terrifying clarity. Before he could even process what he was hearing, an identical 4-note whistle answered from the woods directly to the south, followed immediately by another one from the east and then the west. The abandoned camp was completely surrounded. The chilling harmony of those whistles began to warp into a complex, terrifying dialogue, bouncing off the old rotting wooden facades of the surrounding cabins like a twisted symphony of hunters coordinating a strike. The pitch of the whistles never faltered. It remained hauntingly beautiful, precise, and completely devoid of any human emotion, which made it feel infinitely more mechanical and calculated. It was clear that these entities knew the layout of the valley perfectly, using the echoes to mask their exact distances while steadily tightening an invisible noose around the campsite. The cold air inside the tent seemed to freeze solid as the sound moved from the distant tree lines directly onto the cracked concrete pathways just 30 yards away, accompanied by the occasional synchronous crunch of gravel under a massive, coordinated movement. The whistling didn't stop. It began to multiply, echoing from different parts of the dark valley, growing steadily closer with every passing minute. It sounded like a perfectly synchronized, cold-blooded communication network between people moving through the pitch-black woods without any flashlights. The lone sleeper frantically shook his 3 friends awake, desperately whispering for them to be completely quiet and listen. Within seconds, all 4 of them were sitting rigid in the dark tent, gripped by a wave of pure, unadulterated terror as the rhythmic, melodic whistling circled their camp like a pack of wolves closing in on their prey. Through the thin nylon walls, they suddenly noticed faint, flickering glints of light reflecting off the surrounding trees. They crept toward the tent's mesh window and peered outside into the misty valley. What they saw made their breath hitch in their throats. Emerging from the pitch-black tree line were dozens of slowly moving figures. There were at least 20 or 30 people, all dressed in identical, filthy, faded gray clothing that looked like old factory uniforms. They weren't carrying modern tactical flashlights. Instead, they held old, dim auxiliary lanterns and primitive wooden torches that cast long, dancing shadows across the decaying cabins. They moved with a slow, deliberate, and almost mechanical cadence, completely silent except for the continuous haunting whistling that bounced off the valley walls. Without a single spoken word or command, the massive group stepped onto the dead grass of the clearing and formed a massive, unbroken semicircle right at the edge of the dying campfire's glow. They just stood there in the flickering light, their faces completely pale and hollow, staring directly at the small nylon tent with wide, unblinking eyes. The sheer psychological terror of the scene was overwhelming. The friends realized they were dealing with a highly organized, completely unhinged group or cult that had intentionally allowed them to hike into this isolated valley just to trap them in the dead of night. Suddenly, the whistling abruptly stopped, plunging the camp back into a dead, terrifying silence. One of the figures in the front row slowly raised a long, rusted iron cattle prod, pointing it directly at the tent door. The friends didn't wait to see what would happen next. Acting on pure survival instinct, the largest guy in the group screamed at the top of his lungs, grabbed their heavy camera tripod, and ripped open the back emergency exit of the tent. They bolted out into the dark night, abandoning all of their expensive camping gear, backpacks, and food supplies. As they scrambled into the thick brush behind the dining hall, the entire valley behind them erupted into a frenzied, chaotic storm of loud, aggressive whistling and the heavy thud of dozens of boots sprinting through the mud. The cult was giving chase. The friends ran blindly through the pitch-black forest for 3 agonizing hours, tearing their clothes on sharp branches and falling down steep, rocky ravines in total darkness, guided only by the distant, terrifying sound of the whistling behind them. By some absolute miracle, they reached the main highway just as the sun was rising and flagged down a passing state patrol car. When the police returned to the valley later that afternoon, they found the friends' tent completely shredded into tiny pieces, and all of their expensive equipment had been smashed to dust. Spelled out on the ground using the charred logs from their own campfire was a single chilling word: leave. The deep wilderness of Alaska is often romanticized as the ultimate frontier of absolute freedom, a majestic canvas of untouched snow, towering mountain peaks, and endless pine forests. But those who truly know the backcountry understand that this beautiful landscape is incredibly unforgiving, and its vastness can become a terrifying psychological trap. When you hike dozens of miles away from any established trail or human outpost, you enter a zone where you are completely on your own, cut off from the safety net of modern society. In these isolated territories, the law is represented by the park rangers, dedicated law enforcement officers who patrol the endless terrain to ensure safety. Seeing a ranger uniform in the middle of nowhere usually brings an overwhelming sense of relief to a tired hiker. But late at night, when the freezing darkness completely blankets the woods, that sense of relief can be twisted into pure horror when you realize that anyone can put on a uniform, and the vast forest can easily hide a predator masquerading as your protector. An experienced solo hiker from Denver decided to challenge himself by embarking on a difficult 10-day off-trail journey through a remote, densely forested valley in the Northern Territory of Alaska. He carried a heavy backpack, a reliable satellite communicator, and a calibrated semi-automatic pistol for protection against the local wildlife. By the 7th night of his trek, he was deeply exhausted, his muscles aching from navigating through rugged, rocky terrain and thick fields of dense brush. He found a small hidden clearing on a high ridge overlooking a frozen creek, quickly pitched his small one-person tent, and crawled inside his heavy thermal sleeping bag, desperately needing a long night of deep sleep. The temperature outside plummeted rapidly, creating a thick crystalline frost that completely covered the outer layer of his tent, making the nylon incredibly stiff and brittle. At exactly 1:45 a.m., a sudden, blinding burst of artificial white light pierced through the thin fabric of his tent, completely illuminating the small interior and forcing him to instinctively shield his eyes. Outside, the heavy, calculated crunch of frozen gravel indicated that a person had walked right up to his campsite. A loud, authoritative, and deeply booming voice echoed through the freezing air, demanding that he immediately unzip the tent and step outside for a mandatory backcountry, safety, and permit inspection. The voice claimed to belong to a regional wildlife state ranger who was performing a routine patrol of the sector. The hiker's heart began to race in his chest. He knew that rangers did occasionally patrol these zones, but finding a solo officer walking through a brutal Alaskan forest on foot at 2 a.m, without the sound of an ATV or a vehicle anywhere in the valley, felt deeply disturbing and highly unusual. The psychological tension inside the tiny tent became suffocating as the intense beam of the flashlight remained firmly locked onto the front zipper, casting a long, ominous human silhouette against the frost-covered nylon. The hiker carefully shifted his weight, trying not to make a sound, and peered through a tiny plastic ventilation window to assess the situation outside. In the harsh, flickering glare of the light, his eyes began to pick up small, deeply unsettling details that shattered his sense of security. The stranger was indeed wearing an old faded green jacket that resembled a classic ranger uniform, but it was completely devoid of any official law enforcement patches, badges, or reflective state emblems. On his feet were dirty, oversized rubber hunting boots instead of standard-issue tactical gear, and hanging from his leather utility belt was not a state-issued radio or a taser, but a massive, heavily rusted iron hunting knife with a dark, stained blade. The stranger began to grow visibly impatient, his heavy breathing becoming audible through the fabric as he started to take slow, rhythmic steps around the small perimeter of the tent, dragging his heavy boots through the frozen dirt. He repeatedly struck the side fiberglass support poles with the heavy metal body of his flashlight, causing the entire frame to warp and bend under the force, while his voice dropped into a low, menacing, and almost mocking tone, demanding that the hiker stop hiding and show himself. The hiker realized with absolute spine-chilling certainty that the man outside was a highly calculated predator who used the guise of authority to force isolated campers to willingly open their tents in the middle of the night, leaving them completely defenseless in the dark. Acting on pure survival instinct, the hiker quietly slipped his right hand into his jacket, firmly gripping the cold-textured handle of his semi-automatic pistol and clicking off the safety with a soft, imperceptible click. He intentionally raised his voice, shouting back in a firm, confident tone that he was currently activating his Garmin satellite SOS beacon to notify the state trooper dispatch of their exact coordinates, and that they would be monitoring the entire interaction. The effect was instantaneous. The constant, aggressive tapping on the tent frame froze completely. A heavy, dead silence returned to the clearing for a few agonizing seconds, during which the silhouette outside remained perfectly rigid, listening intently. Suddenly, the blinding beam of the light was clicked off, plunging the clearing back into absolute darkness. The hiker heard the fast, heavy thud of rubber boots sprinting away into the dense brush, disappearing into the vast forest within moments. The hiker stayed awake for the rest of the night, his gun aimed firmly at the door, realizing that in the deep woods, the worst monsters always wear a human face. The wilderness has a terrifying way of preserving the tragic secrets of those who never made it back to civilization. When a person vanishes deep within a dense, unmapped forest, their physical body might disappear, but the inanimate objects they left behind, their clothes, their gear, their equipment, remain frozen in time, slowly being reclaimed by nature. Finding a piece of abandoned property while hiking through the woods is always a deeply eerie experience, a stark reminder of human vulnerability against the overwhelming power of the elements. It forces your mind to immediately start constructing dark theories about what exactly went wrong. But the true horror begins when you realize that the object wasn't simply lost by a careless tourist years ago. It was left behind as a marker, a disturbing piece of evidence connecting a past tragedy to a living nightmare that is currently unfolding right in front of your eyes. Two brothers from Portland, who were avid outdoorsmen and amateur survivalists, decided to spend a weekend exploring a highly dense, strictly unmanaged sector of the old-growth forests in central Oregon. They deliberately traveled far beyond the marked public trails, navigating through ancient, moss-covered fields of volcanic rock and climbing over massive fallen pine trees that had been rotting on the forest floor for decades. Late in the afternoon, while carving a path through a particularly thick patch of wild ferns, the younger brother stumbled over something hard buried beneath a deep layer of decaying pine needles. He cleared the dirt away and uncovered a heavy, militaristic tactical backpack. The nylon was severely weathered, faded by years of sun exposure, and completely covered in a thick layer of green forest moss, indicating it had been sitting undisturbed in that exact spot for an incredibly long time. Curiosity completely overtook them, and they decided to open the rusted, mud-caked zippers to see what was inside. The backpack contained a collection of deeply disturbing personal items, a heavily water-damaged leather journal with pages that had fused together into a solid block, a set of keys to a vehicle that had likely been towed away years ago, and an old high-end film camera wrapped tightly in a protective plastic bag. The brothers were thrilled by the mysterious historical find and decided to keep the camera in their pack, intending to bring it to a professional shop in the city to see if the film could still be salvaged. They hiked another half-mile to a small clearing near a steep, rocky ridge, quickly pitched their large dome tent, lit a small campfire, and fell asleep as the cold night fog began to roll in from the mountains. At around 3 a.m., the older brother was suddenly startled awake by a sharp, violent ripping sound coming from the upper canopy of the pine trees directly above their tent. It sounded as though a heavy object was dragging against the branches, followed by the distinctive low sound of rapid, frantic scratching on the rough bark of a tree trunk. He shook his younger brother awake, and both of them sat perfectly still in their sleeping bags, holding their breath as a wave of intense adrenaline flooded their systems. A moment later, a heavy thud echoed right outside their tent, shaking the damp earth beneath them. Someone, or something, had just dropped down from the high branches of the ancient pine tree and was now standing on the grass, just inches away from their nylon door. The psychological terror escalated to an unbearable level when a long, incredibly thin human shadow was cast across the tent wall by the dying embers of their campfire. The entity outside didn't move aggressively. Instead, it began to gently scratch its fingernails against the tightly stretched nylon fabric, producing a low, rhythmic, and agonizingly slow scraping sound that felt like a psychological torture tactic. The brothers could hear a low, wet, and rhythmic clicking sound coming from the stranger's throat, a disturbing animalistic vocalization that indicated the person was completely detached from reality. The older brother grabbed his powerful tactical flashlight, clicked it on, and aimed the intense beam through the small mesh window, illuminating the thick branches of the tree directly opposite them. Sitting crouched on a massive, thick branch 20 feet above the ground was a human being. It was an incredibly emaciated, wild-looking man, dressed in tattered, filthy rags that were completely caked in dried mud and pine sap. His hair was long and matted, his skin was deathly pale, and his wide, unblinking eyes reflected the bright white light of the flashlight like a nocturnal predator. He didn't flinch from the glare. He simply stared directly down into the lens with a twisted, hollow grin on his face. The brothers screamed in terror, grabbed their vehicle keys, and bolted out of the tent into the freezing night, running blindly through the dark forest for miles until they finally reached their truck. Days later, after notifying the authorities, the camera film was successfully developed by a specialist. The final 5 frames on the old roll, taken 3 years prior by a missing tourist, depicted the exact same emaciated man, crouching on that exact same tree branch, staring down at the camera with that identical, terrifying grin. The human brain is a highly complex organ, wired by thousands of years of evolution to recognize the familiar patterns, familiar voices, and the comforting sounds of those we love. In a state of extreme isolation, like the deep, dark woods at night, hearing a loved one's voice can instantly shatter our intense fear, acting as a powerful psychological anchor that promises safety and warmth. But when you are camped deep within an unmapped forest, dozens of miles from any cellular tower or main highway, the sudden appearance of a familiar voice is not a sign of rescue. It is a deeply unnatural distortion of reality. The deep pine forests have a strange way of playing tricks on the human mind. But the most terrifying nightmare occurs when you realize that the voice calling out to you from the pitch-black tree line isn't a trick of your mind at all. It is a calculated, chilling imitation, performed by an entity that understands human vulnerability and uses our deepest emotional bonds to lure us directly into the freezing darkness. 2 lifelong female friends from Minneapolis, who were highly experienced backpackers, decided to plan an autumn camping trip to a remote, densely wooded peninsula in northern Minnesota. They wanted to experience the raw, untamed beauty of the wilderness before the brutal winter snows completely blocked the local trails. They spent an entire day hiking through miles of dense, silent pine forests, navigating around hidden bogs and crossing cold, rushing streams until they finally reached a secluded clearing surrounded by massive, towering red pines. The surrounding atmosphere was incredibly heavy and still. The freezing autumn air seemed to hang completely motionless between the trees, and the absolute lack of any wind created an oppressive, unnatural silence that echoed with every single breath they took. They pitched their sturdy dome tent, cooked a warm meal, and quickly retreated inside their heavy thermal sleeping bags to protect themselves from the rapidly dropping nighttime temperature. At exactly 2:45 a.m., the silence of the forest was suddenly broken by a faint, distant sound echoing from the thick tree line to the west. One of the girls, who was a light sleeper, instantly woke up, her body freezing completely as she strained her ears against the dark. At first, the sound was muffled, resembling a low rhythmic murmur bouncing off the thick pine trunks. But as it drew steadily closer to their clearing, The sound began to morph into a highly distinct, perfectly recognizable human cadence. A cold wave of absolute shock flooded her system when she realized she could clearly understand the words. It was a deep, warm, and comforting male voice, calling out her first name over and over again, gently asking her to unzip the tent and step outside because he had finally found her after a long drive. It was, without a single shadow of a doubt, the exact voice of her own father. The psychological confusion and terror of that moment were completely overwhelming, as her rational mind frantically tried to process the impossible situation. She sat up in her sleeping bag, her hands trembling violently as she reached for the front zipper of the tent, completely driven by an intense emotional impulse to run toward the comforting voice of her protector. But before her fingers could even touch the metal zipper tab, her friend frantically grabbed her arm, locking her hand in an incredibly tight, bruising grip. Her friend's face was deathly pale, her wide, unblinking eyes filled with a level of pure terror that was completely paralyzing. In a desperate, breathless whisper, her friend reminded her of a cold, undeniable fact. Her father had suffered a severe medical accident 3 years ago, leaving him completely paralyzed and confined to a specialized hospital bed in a city over 3,000 miles away from this isolated Minnesota forest. The crushing realization of this fact instantly shattered the fragile illusion of safety, and the air inside the tiny tent became suffocatingly heavy as both girls sat perfectly rigid in the dark, clutching each other in absolute terror. Outside, the familiar voice continued to call out from the edge of the clearing, repeating the exact same comforting phrases with a slow, rhythmic monotony that began to feel increasingly artificial and hollow. It was clear that whatever was standing in the darkness didn't actually know her father. It was simply repeating a perfectly captured auditory fragment, using the emotional frequency of a loved one to force them to willingly open their small shelter. The voice began to step closer, the heavy crunch of dry pine needles indicating that the entity was now standing just 15 feet away from their nylon door. Suddenly, the warm, comforting tone of the voice began to violently malfunction, as if the entity was losing its grip on the complex human imitation. The pitch abruptly dropped into a harsh, mechanical rasp, the words becoming scrambled, broken, and completely devoid of any human intonation. The phrase "I found you" was repeated over and over again, but the voice began to warp into a deep, booming, and guttural animalistic growl that vibrated through the damp earth beneath their tent. The entity began to walk around their shelter in slow, heavy circles, dragging something massive through the dry brush, while the distorted human voice gradually dissolved into a long, agonizing, and highly disturbing low-pitch howl that echoed through the valley for hours. The girls sat motionless, holding their breath until the first gray light of dawn finally forced the entity to retreat back into the dense pines. They abandoned all their gear, ran frantically to the highway, and never returned to those woods.